Welcome everybody. So my name's Alex Copping. So I'm going to chair the session, and we're going to be ably accompanied by Emmanuel as well. So the focus of this session is going to be research associated with COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19. And really this is a fresh area for research, isn't it, which is destined to grow. And I'm delighted just looking at these three papers, how it's starting to sort of show where the research interests are being formed. So the first presentation is looking at this understanding of how the adoption of building spaces shape or are shaped by human behaviour in disrupted use scenarios. So that's Jiajing. And then the second one will be designing for neurodiversity by Kirsten. And then the third one, COVID-19 crisis management left tacit knowledge behind. Okay, so what we'll do is I'll run the presentation, and then we'll stop, and then we'll have a question and answer session at after each of the presentations. Okay, and let's hope others join us along the way. So the recording, let's.
It should have started.
Do you think?
Yeah, it started.
It's starting. Okay, and I'll play the presentation now, and.
Hi everyone,
there we go.
My name is Jiajing Feng, and I am a PhD student in the School of Construction Management and Engineering at University of Reading. Dragana and Ellyn are my supervisors. Today I'm going to present my research about understanding how the adaptations of building spaces shape or are shaped by human behavior in disruptive use scenarios, a literature review. The breakout of COVID-19 has put us in different built environment. In terms of that we are following different rules, keeping distance to interact with the environment and people around. Once a building has been constructed, it does not stop changing and adapting. Under such new challenging scenario, we want to understand firstly how the process that mutual influence between building space and human behavior goes through under the disruptive situations. What and how these changes or adaptations are enacted. Based on this, it is important firstly to understand the interactions between human behavior and building space. Therefore, this paper identified literatures related to this topic. A total of 97 key papers are selected through screening on Scopes and Web of Science database. 3 themes were discussed to help investigate potential ways to study this topic on the disrupted scenario in order to answer the questions raised at the beginning. Finally, some questions and discussion about the future research will be concluded. Here we only discuss the physical aspect of space. It is thought commonly as an empty volume or an aggregate of things, enclosed materially or experientially in some respect that may accommodate users or equipment. The early studies considered space as a neutral container of human activity, while later studies had more behavioral or psychological perspectives and contend that space also plays an active role in shaping social life. Human behavior does not simply happen in space, it has its own spatial forms. The question is, how exactly does this happen? This question discloses further that actually not only we use building spaces to create and reinforce ourselves, but at the same time our behaviors redesign the spaces. Therefore, this process is consistently mutual. But specifically, how is this process going on? Different environmental factors interact with different human behavior and under different scenarios with adaptation. These are the 3 themes identified. We will see the intertwined relationship and the consistent adaptation among these factors. The following sections will discuss how existing literature studied these factors, and then elicits a question about how we can study the disruptive scenarios such as the current pandemic. The environmental factors here we discussed include factors that people perceive, experience, and interact with the built environment to enable or allow various behaviors. The most frequently studied is space layout and space configuration. The space layout is thought to be nonverbal message that impact behavior. such as in the workplace context, open and private layout will influence people's communication and work patterns differently. The space configuration is sometimes studied together with space layout, defining the shape, size, and relations of building dimensions. Also includes the signage or other information clues influencing the wayfinding evacuation behavior. While many studies stay at the general level and some results are contradictory, therefore, how to frame these concepts systematically and investigate how specifically they interact with human behavior requires further research. Other environmental factors such as lighting, acoustic, or other sensory factors have been involved in some studies, which may link to other disciplines like psychology, urban planning. Overall, the environmental factor studies are still fragmentary in some degree and lack more systematic and theoretical framework as well as the methods used to conduct these studies. For the human behavior, the most frequently studied type is workplace or organizational behavior to understand people's work performance, motivation, or communication with others. The wayfinding, movement, and navigation behavior are also widely discussed. Another type is identified as the everyday behavior, such as seating preference, window opening, or social interaction. And some of the studies focused on emergency behavior, such as evacuation. For these studies, the boundaries for identifying and classifying different human behaviors or activities are still not very clear, especially that human behavior is very complicated and with several different dimensions. Some human behavior have not been studied a lot. Scenarios are instruments for ordering people's perceptions about alternative future environments in which today's discussion might play out and help improve existing trajectories. For the literature reviewed from a broad context, these studies have two typical scenarios, daily life or emergency situations. From another angle, the different places like university, hospital, workplace, or domestic buildings also provide different scenarios in terms of the physical environment surrounding people, tasks to be conducted. Furthermore, people with different roles, education level, prior experiences can also set different scenarios for the research. At the same time, these different scenarios are interacting with the ever-changing needs from users and building spaces. This then leads to the discussion about such adaptation process. The building space and human behavior are always facing changing scenarios and adaptations. Some researchers proposed that there is a direct and causal link between them. While this is too simplistic, not only environmental features impact human behaviors, the socio-cultural aspects such as people's roles, the informal interaction also affect how they behave. Both environmental and social determinism should be avoided. More studies can investigate how we can understand such a complex and dynamic relationship. Based on the literature review, the current COVID-19 context provides new scenario to be studied. This is a less intensive but chronic emergency situations, allowing us to frame it as a type of disruptive scenario where some disturbances occur compared with normal routines. If we analyze this situation with the themes we used in the literature review, we can see that environmental factors such as visual clues, signage, or other facilities are guiding people's behaviors, but how actually they work can be further investigated. There are different human behavior like keeping social distance, using one-way system, following different procedures to go to public place, and the adaptation between building space and human behavior on such scenario, like people break the rules using the shortcuts rather than the one-way system. Afterwards, the building space may also be adapted to keep people safe. Different environmental factors interact with different human behavior on the various scenarios. The relationship among these cannot be simply determined by a single factor, but is more complex and dynamic. How can we study the new scenario by using and improving the existing framework to help keep people safe and comfortable is still a big question. There are a lot of interesting aspects that we can study, and the above discussion opens up a series of research questions, such as that we can still discuss from the 3 themes talked before, or to understand the relationship among these factors, or how we can make use of it. Also from the stakeholder perspective, who are involved and how can we take advantages from this? Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you. Well done, Jiajing. Thank you very much for that. That's
Thank you.
a very interesting presentation, which as expected, presents more questions than it has answers, doesn't it? Really, in the way that you've conducted your research. Right. So, we got a question for Jiajing, please. Okay. Well, let me kick off then. So let me ask you a question about priorities, really. You posed those questions at the end, didn't you, in terms of potentially what needs to be investigated in terms of the consequence of the disruption of the COVID scenario. So what sort of priority listing would you give in terms of those issues of redesign of spaces and human interaction? What are the most important, do you think, that we should be looking at?
Oh, I think that's a good question. Yeah, because I've mentioned so many different aspects, and I think from the building emergency management perspective, we should firstly to have a better kind of management of how the building reacts to people's responses under the COVID situation, that how the different facility manager can deal with people's different behavior and to help them keep safe. I think that's the first one I will consider. And that's also the quick one that we can keep the resilience to such a changing environment quickly,
Yeah, I think that's where I would sort of head first as well, actually. And I think it's the ventilation issue, isn't it, in terms of building management that, is appearing to be ultra critical at the moment, because, here at universities, we're wanting to get back into university lecture theatres, but we're being prevented because the ventilation is assessed as not being appropriate anymore. And that's really, really critical. So, issues of building and space management is absolutely critical. You're right, indeed.
Although you could argue that ventilation in lecture theatres have never really been fantastic, because there's always those spots where the 20 minutes in people are going to fall asleep because there's not enough air exchange.
Yeah,
which I kind of miss those days.
those overheated, smelly sort of sections of your lecture theatres. Yes.
Yeah, but this paper raises a really interesting point, because as you were going through, I've been looking at. I mean, there are a number of methods, whether it's looking at septet or gendered space, but then when you have, could we argue that that COVID wasn't really sort of a black swan event? I mean, people, were saying, and there's been movies about, having a pandemic, and we're just like, oh no, globalization, we can all travel freely. What could possibly go wrong? But I think it is an interesting one, because the spaces that we will have in the future will have to be very different, because we can't, while we would like to sort of have this idea of returning to normal, COVID normal, or whatever that might be, or it might completely change the way that we use with our buildings. I mean, ventilation is like one of the first ones, but also the surfaces that we touch. could be another area as well. But I think that interesting thing that you were talking about with the different stakeholders, because even just mapping that, because it's not just the users of the space, it's the people who work there, it's the people who might manage that space, the people who clean it, the people. It's sort of that. It's beyond the big data. It's that warm data sort of series of systems that sort of wobble around built spaces. It's you've opened a can of worms.
Yeah. Very good. So we've got a question from the chat here. Is there any? Sorry, shall I read? Yep. So is there any link between the social practice theory with your topic?
Social practice.
Maybe
this is one you could start looking into if it will benefit your research area then.
Yes.
Let me allow Majid to speak, and he might be able to expand on that question a bit. Majid, are you there?
Is Majid here? So
his details have now vanished, actually, after
okay,
me
so
clicking on. Yeah. Oh, here he is. Yes. Okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Hi, Majid.
Hello.
We wondered whether you could just expand on the question that you've typed in the chat for us, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Jiajing, how are you? Thank you for this interesting topic. It is one of my interested area to me. I mean, I'm also a PhD candidate currently at the University of Reading. So, as far as I know, there is something has to link this human behavior with social practice. I mean, so are you recommended that a designer, for example, have to understand or have to understand the social practice or social behavior of the occupant of the building in order to understand more the adaptation of building spaces?
Yes, I think because how people use the space also links with their social identity or social roles, and also how the space are designed and managed by different people's social roles also affect how people use these spaces. I think there's a link between.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jiajing. Thanks very much for your responses. So we will now move on to the second presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so redesigning for neurodiversity.
Welcome to this presentation. It's called Designing for Neurodiversity, Reimagining the Home for a COVID Normal Life. I'm Andrew. I'm a lecturer at the Architecture faculty at the University of Melbourne.
And hi, I'm Kirsten Day, and I'm also a lecturer in architecture at Melbourne Uni. The purpose of our research was to look at what we can learn from design for neurodiversity and how we can apply this, not only for work that we do for the neurodiverse field, but also how this might be applied to housing more generally.
So just to begin with some key concepts around designing for disability in general. And one of the key sort of ideas is the idea of a person-environment fit. It was an idea developed by Alexander in the 70s, and it's this idea that there's a relationship between the person and the environment, and that how well they fit each other really is a measure of how well the environment's working for people with a disability. Around that, there are several ideas or concepts or terms that often get used interchangeably, but in fact actually have specific meanings and are different. And that's around accessibility, usability, and universal design. And so some really great work was done with this in Sweden. So when we talk about accessibility, we're talking here about how well the person and the environment fit together. Yeah, and so it's a relative term in the sense that each person will either find it more or less able to function in the environment. Usability is slightly different, and it's more subjective, and it's because it's about not just can you access a space, but can you do what you want to do within that. And so it has elements of the person, of the environment, but also of the activity. So it's subjective because it's really about satisfaction of that person. Can I do tasks in this environment? Universal design assumes there's one population, but with differing abilities and different qualities. And so there's trying to design to accommodate all of those. And so in that, it becomes a process rather than an outcome per se. So those are the sort of three different concepts that we work with.
You'll find in our paper that we look a lot, or we have a review of the world's best practice in terms of the guidelines that are available. We've been looking at Aronson and Steele, but of these, and looking at how we can adapt those to thinking about design more specifically rather than sort of the network of things that are around that. We've focused on three key areas, which are sensory zoning, spatial sequencing, and escape spaces. Mustafa sums this up quite well, really well, saying that to design the built environment for autism, one must calm it down, break it down into manageable experiences in discrete spaces, organise those spaces in a sensory and temporally logical flow, and accommodate for sensory overload escape. And these three areas are what we have been looking at in our case studies.
Okay, so what does that mean as far as actual built form and those kinds of things go? And so we'll go through each of those three concepts, and we'll use some examples from the case studies that we cited for the paper. The case studies are buildings that have been designed specifically for people on the autism spectrum. So specifically for people who are neurodiverse. So the first of those concepts, sensory zoning, it's really talking about the level of sensory experience in a different space within a dwelling. And so we know that kitchens are different from bathrooms, for example. And so if we take the example here, the top left, there's a kitchen. You see, Kirsten's just showing where it is on the plan there. And so what does it mean? What's the sensory experience of a kitchen? Well, they're loud. They're quite often humid. They're hard surfaces. There's smells. There's a whole bunch of stuff, people moving around. So they're quite active dynamic zones. How is that different from, for example, the image you see there on the bottom left, where you have a small nook there. It's a little tiny seat. It's all enclosed. It's soft. It's quiet. It's calm. There are books there. It's still quite open. You can see out the window, but they're very different. The sensory experience of those two spaces are very different. One's loud, it's hard, it's noisy. The other's quiet and soft and constrained. And so those are different levels. And so the idea is to consider those through all the different parts of the apartments. One interesting thing you can see here from this is it's not just the sensory spaces, and this is what Kirsten will talk about in the next slide, but also how they relate to each other. So you can see where the kitchen is up the top there, space 13, whereas these quiet zones in the bottom of the photo, they're at the end of the corridors. You can see them down near corridor 5, right down the end. So they're separated out because they're different zones. They're different sensory experiences.
In these two case studies, we have Sweetwater, which maps out the transition between areas of sensitivity. So these diagrams are at a much broader scale to have an adequate mapping over a site. But also we're able to look at this at a micro scale as well. So even where we have an apartment where we have a transition point before you start to make your journey into the living space, that there's a space that separates the bedroom. And so while it is a very contained space, there is still this definition about those transition between the areas of intensity.
So you can see it can be quite subtle, but it needs to be thought about and designed. So the last of the three examples of ours is escape spaces or spaces of retreat and seclusion. And here's an example. Here's a home and a school in the UK, Clent in the UK. So you see in the plan on the right-hand side, see the two bedroom wings on either side. And you can see at the bottom of the bedroom, each bedroom wing, there's a sensory studio. So there's a purpose-built room there to isolate, to block out the senses, the things that are causing agitation, causing distress for people. But it doesn't have to be specific designed-in zone. It can also be zones within the broader dwelling, but that allow for a retreat. And there's a really good example here in the bedrooms from this particular school. So you can see on the left-hand side there, the green bedroom. So that bench in the corner, the little seat in the corner there is triangular. So you can sit back against the wall. The ceiling comes down there, so it lowers it. It's open to the room, but within that little nook, a little niche there, there's a feeling of enclosure and a feeling where you can retreat to. You can see out the window, people can't see you. So it's a really subtle bit of design, but it's a fantastic one because it actually allows you to withdraw. Yeah, not retreat all the way into a sort of locked room, although that, you know, as I said, the Sensory Studio shows an example of that, but it doesn't have to be that sort of discreet. It can actually be just part of the design, but it needs to be think about, where do I retreat to? Okay, so just what does that mean? What are we sort of concluding? As we said at the beginning, how can designing for neurodiversity, the lessons we get that, feed into a wider range of housing? And so what we know is that the role of the home is an expanding one. COVID has taught us that accessible design is absolutely critical, but it's clearly not enough. It's not enough just to be able to get inside a dwelling. Yeah. Universal design has a lot of positives, but by its universal nature doesn't really adapt very well to personal sort of idiosyncrasies and particularities. And so what we've been looking at and what we advocate is for a usability design approach that can capture the creativity, the uniqueness of individual people, and be able to deal with that, but still be flexible. So what we're looking to push forward is how do we have a COVID normal approach to all housing that recognises sensory intensity and the differences, the transitions between those zones, and the need sometimes to sort of escape and to withdraw, alongside the conventional technical considerations about air supply and light and insulation and all of those kinds of things.
Then the next stage of the research is really thinking about, well, there are a whole lot of lessons that we can learn from the guidelines that have been created for designing for neurodiversity, and how we can then start to apply these as we start to think about, what might COVID normal house look like? And are there spaces that we're working more from home, that we are working with other people? And so there needs to be some thought that it's not just about the sort of the basics of an operation of a house, but also more about the experience. And how might that work, particularly with apartments and the type of housing that is being currently built en masse. So we need to sort of look at these perspectives and think, well, how can we best improve the experience of housing? Did you want to add any more, Andrew?
No, I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We wish you well and all the other presenters at the conference. And with a bit of luck, maybe we'll be able to see everybody in person, possibly next year. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done. Fantastic double act. Well done indeed. That's the first one I've seen, the double act.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension between one of us sort of not saying too much, because otherwise it's going to be a 25-minute presentation. So it's just sort of sitting back and, yeah.
I think you did very well. Very good indeed. Thank you very much. So again, opportunity for questions, please. Well, maybe I could start again. Could I just again? I think it's a presentation which has thrown up a huge amount of questions, hasn't it? As opposed to sort of solving a few. But and again, I think my question is where do you start? It's it's one thing to think about the implications of COVID on a normal house, but then there's another stage in terms of bringing in all the complications of autism as well, isn't it? It's Where are you thinking of starting, Kirsten?
That's a really good question. Because even when we were starting to talk about this, because we've Andrew and I have run a number of studios now where we've looked at design for neurodiversity, and so it's going through sort of the basics of, well, how do we design? And then as we talk about this, we're going, well, actually these spaces would be really good for people who are neurotypical, and just having spaces where you can withdraw, spaces where particularly in COVID, where we've all been stuck at home, and you're sort of, in my case, you've got a bit of a bench in a corner next to the kitchen, where you're trying to sort of work and operate, and how do we create those spaces that enables us to sort of turn off, do things, have other experiences, particularly with apartments. There are, again, and sort of going back to Jiajing's presentation as well, there's a whole lot of systems around us, and this discussion of, well, if we're going to change the model, well, how do we change the model of apartments or medium density housing in a developer-driven economy, and then we'll just dismantle the whole sort of neoliberal system while we're at it. But then there are other things, like we've got now WELS certifications, and so would there be a consumer demand to have these spaces, particularly if we're looking at lockdowns, or not so much, I suppose once we've got vaccination rates, but is this going to be something that goes away? And so do we all return back to our offices, or do we use this as an opportunity to have a more sort of flexible work-life sort of arrangement? So I don't know, I've actually answered your question there, but...
Well, probably because it's such a big question to answer that, so we're all sort of mulling this over in our minds, because we don't know, first of all, how this is all going to play out, do we, in terms of COVID normal. We don't know what that's going to be, and therefore you can't really design until you know what you're designing for. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. And I guess with and sort of answering also one of the questions in chat, the lessons learned from COVID. When we're looking at future design, I think one of the first things is looking at ventilation and what that means. We found with a lot of the hotel design here that the spread in quarantine hotels was really to do with ventilation, and as people opened up doors, the air moved through, and so it's ventilation surfaces, how many touch points do we need, and starting to think about how we might move through space that is slightly differently, because if it's not COVID, there will be the next thing. It's there's so many fantastic things about having a very sort of global world, but then there are other things in a global world too, like getting on a plane, getting a cold, or in this case a pandemic. So
just to add a little bit, I guess we're currently in a point where we're trying to learn to deal with what we've seen, which is COVID, that type of respiratory issues, and then moving forward, we don't know what else is there, so we might have to include biologists and other people in research. But then the problem becomes, how far do we go with them? We can't plan every building using them, because then we'll be designing for something that may never come up, and it's all about money once again.
Yeah, exactly. Because it does, and that I think is the interesting sticking point, because there's the ideal things that we could design as design teams to make these amazing spaces, but then it's also, but who pays for that? So it's a nice sort of can of worms.
So these are projects which you're setting for your students, are they?
Yes,
challenging them. Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is fascinating too, from the aspect. I mean, I have a personal perspective on this, because we were located just outside New York when the pandemic hit. My husband works in Midtown New York and took a bus into the city every day. And we have at that time, we had 2 neurotypical and 2 neurodiverse people in our family in a relatively small dwelling. And because of COVID, we ended up buying a much larger house in Pennsylvania. And retreating to lots of rooms with doors. Because after COVID went full tilt, there were 5 of us on Zoom all the time. And, a small space doesn't work well. Open plans don't work well. for neurotypical, let alone, two neurodiverse and two neurotypical trying to inhabit these dwellings. Yeah. So it's a fascinating topic for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Oh, I'm going to read one out. How does the lesson learned from the research going forward affect the design of spaces, specifically hierarchy of spaces in the future, or any trends or changes in architecture of residential spaces? I think you were just touching on this area. So the lessons learned going forward and how it affects hierarchies in spaces of the future.
I think for the takeaway out of the studios and the research that Andrew and I have done has really been looking at those transition points from spaces. So even if it's just small, it is I'm going from one space into another, and so there's that mental preparation, whether it's going into a bedroom where that's my quiet space, that's it doesn't have the same intense space as say a living room that you might share with 3 or 4 other people, or a kitchen that's loud and noisy and that the sort of sound bounces around. That there is spaces that you can retreat and just go, right, world, enough. I'm just going to be here and just repair for even just for a moment. But just having an arrangement of spaces where you can sort of go and look out the window, but it's there's some words that are that would be there normally, but they're not going out. But just having alternatives, and whether it's something that we do. And with interiors, whether we're looking at sort of altering ceiling heights or thinking about the materials that we use that might deal with acoustics. I mean, the number of studio presentations that we've seen where it's concrete floors and concrete walls, and but that just intensifies the sound. And so I guess there are a number of things in the choices of material. How do we heat and cool our houses or apartments, dwellings? So I guess, it's thinking more about the quality of space rather than how much can I pack in to a sort of a square meter, and thinking about, with curtain walls, with high-rise apartment buildings, that there is some space where it's not just exposure through, the glass curtain wall systems. So it's, privacy, I guess. So it's about, quality of space over, it's throwing over the whole capitalist system, I guess. Because, that's just easily done. We'll do it by Friday.
Small endeavor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew, as well, and Kirsten. That's great. All right, so moving on to our third presentation. So, COVID-19 crisis management left tacit knowledge behind. So here we go.
I'm Ellyn Lester, an Assistant Dean at Pennsylvania College of Technology. My paper is titled, COVID-19 Crisis Management Left Tacit Knowledge Behind. As the new decade dawned, New York City's building boom was going into its 7th consecutive year. The New York Building Congress forecasted the continuation of an almost 10% increase in construction spending, and the growth in construction employment was starting its 9th year of uninterrupted growth. No one predicted this growth would come to an abrupt halt at the end of the first quarter, and that by the end of June, the American Institute of Architects would report a record drop in architecture billings. Construction Dive's June 30th daily report noted that the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, had halted all of its work, including the $51.5 billion subway modernization plan. Numerous other projects were put on an extended hold. Volatility was the order of the day. The impetus for this extreme plunge in billings was COVID-19, a global pandemic. Drastic changes followed. By mid-March, New Yorkers were under a stay-at-home order, followed by enforced curfews, mandatory social distancing, and mask mandates. All non-essential businesses were closed, resulting in extreme levels of unemployment, lines at food banks, and mental health challenges. Architects and engineers immediately transitioned to remote work, including those working on essential projects. At first, they were generally optimistic, noting the ease of transitioning to remote work, setting up Zoom or Microsoft Teams meetings, and attending digital lunches. One mentioned a uniform video background as a way to bolster team cohesion. Another discussed the challenge of sending submittals to architects' homes, especially the difficulty of storing large samples. Previous workflow was assumed, but workflow discussions now became daily occurrences. These changes were only the beginning. Firms are still facing shifting mindsets and new workflows.
These graphs represent the first wave of COVID-19 in New York City during part of our 6-month study period, the first 2 quarters of 2020. The top graph is the number of cases, the middle graph is hospitalizations, and the bottom graph is the number of deaths. This provides the context of the crisis the case study firm faced. Although the paper encompasses much more, this presentation will focus on the health of the firm throughout the crisis. The next 3 slides are images of Times Square during the mandatory lockdown. If you've ever visited New York City, you've probably been swept along by the hordes of tourists that visit this area every year. Such lockdown images are incredibly shocking, but the sad truth is that these images were simultaneously overlaid by the unceasing ambulance sirens responding to calls or transporting critical patients to hospitals all over the city.
Using case study methodology, the evolution of one architecture firm's responses were tracked for 6 months. All firm emails were reviewed. Internal and external announcements, procedural changes, and business processes were all also analyzed. Emails were the primary source of data. Cataloging emails prior to the pandemic provided a baseline, which were compared to emails after the pandemic to identify and track changes. Emails were chosen because they were time-stamped, quantifiable, and provide examples of formal and informal messages associated with specific actions at defined moments. The documents analyzed fostered information exchange and established alternative business processes. Project-focused, quantifiable knowledge sharing resulted in improved management and productivity. Implicit messaging reassured employees whose worlds had been turned upside down. Management tactics were considered largely successful, and they were successful in the short term. But tacit knowledge exchange, the ephemeral knowledge that is often shared informally, was missing.
Staffing matrices provided one source of raw data, which allowed firm performance to be tracked longitudinally during our study. Architecture firms are engines of generating billable hours, and firm leadership constantly attempt to maintain quality while driving up the percentage of utilization, or the number of billable hours divided by the number of staff on payroll. The data gleaned from the staffing matrices is represented by this table. To the right are 3 graphs that summarize the longitudinal trends, which will be discussed in the following 3 slides. This graph depicts the aggregate utilization over the course of the study. The x-axis depicts the weeks in the 6 months, 1 through 27. The y-axis depicts the sum of billable hours, which by itself is meaningful as a measure of raw volume of economic activity, but which becomes more meaningful when related to the number of salaried employees generating these hours. This graph depicts the average percent utilized, which is when the billable hours are divided by the number of employees on salary. The x-axis again depicts weeks. The y-axis depicts the percentage of employees billable. If a firm can maintain 96% utilization, profitability is highly likely. If it falls below 92%, cost-cutting measures must take place for the firm to avoid going into the red. The quickest way to eliminate costs is to eliminate salaries. However, the fewer number of billable hours in aggregate, seen on the previous graph, the less profit generated by the firm. Architecture is a low-margin business. This graph is a stacked line graph depicting staffing over the course of the study. The x-axis again depicts weeks. Blue is 100% billable. Orange is anything less than 100% billable. The y-axis is the number of employees. Orange plus blue equals the total number of staff, which is the gray line. Note that the gray line is consistent until week 12 and then increases by a few staff over the course of the study. This is unusual, and in most architecture firms laid off employees after COVID hit and projects got put on hold. Our case study firm worked very hard to hold off layoffs, which did not occur until shortly after July 3rd, the end of our study period, and after the first wave of COVID had formed, crested, and run its course.
Semi-structured interviews with firm leaders and staff probed perceptions of the effectiveness of these measures. Responses were compared to semi-structured interviews from the previous year with the same subjects, whose earlier interviews provided a baseline for comparison. Since tacit knowledge exchange deficits were not recognized until the researchers' probing questions prompted it during these interviews, this speaks to the stealth qualities of tacit knowledge exchange and how it was not dealt with in any systematic way by this firm. This may be the case because those sharing tacit knowledge have difficulty explaining how or what they do. Even if town halls and Friday lunches provide increased opportunities for conventional knowledge exchange, the loss of in-between moments during the pandemic eliminated an ecosystem for the exchange of tacit knowledge. Participants acknowledged the loss and speculated that integrating new processes to address the shortfall moving forward should be the goal. Unfortunately, no one had any idea of what form of these processes might take. The study provided a glimpse into crisis behavior during and immediately following an uncontrolled external incident of unprecedented magnitude. It also explored the efficacy of this firm's actions and its attempts to control and share knowledge during an uncertain, ambiguous, and uncontrollable event that placed the firm in existential peril.
Thank you. Wonderful, fascinating study. Okay, so where do we kick off with questions? Emmanuel, do you have one?
I was going to say, in terms of the structured interviews that were done, were there any areas that you thought, because people have a lot of things to say about this topic, especially since people feel they're embedded, were there a lot of areas that you wanted to, or themes you wanted to explore that couldn't come out?
You mean in the span of time of that interview?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that there are definitely subtopics or offshoots that are fascinating about this topic. And it is, as I mentioned in the presentation, part of sort of a larger study that I was and am continuing to do about mentorship and this idea of tacit knowledge sharing in mentorship. So that was really where I started. And as a portion of that larger study or previous study, I had interviewed these people before. So, and those were face-to-face interviews. And I'd actually interviewed them a couple of different times in face-to-face interviews. So going to this virtual environment wasn't as challenging as it might have been with someone I had not spoken to before. But they did become pretty wide-ranging conversations because they were semi-structured interviews. So the follow-up questions were really the ones that sort of guided people back to the topic, if you will. And I tried to keep it fairly bounded because of time, but there are definitely things that came out of that interview that could be studied in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the reason I was asking that is I have done stuff on tacit knowledge in the past for small construction firms. And I know that with them being away or being apart from other people they work with, they would say that they can't transfer any knowledge to them. So right. I guess there's a lot of things that people would be picking up on saying, well, how's any of this being transferred? Because, you know, I don't even know if they've learned it or if they could even use what I've given to them. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think that's definitely the case, and definitely very common, you know, and I think we took a lot of things for granted prior to the pandemic, especially in more of the design-oriented professions where people were and have often believed in open plan studios and this sort of integration of mentoring or osmosis and sharing knowledge through osmosis of sitting next to someone and listening to a crit. It's a very challenging situation, that's for sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's just a quick question about your methodology. So you say you were given access to the emails. Were you able to actually read the content of those emails as well? Gosh, that's quite yeah. And so you were reading and that was open access, was it, to all the emails in the company?
Quite unusual. Yeah, quite unusual.
And so you could start forming an understanding from there what was being left out in respect to tacit knowledge. And all that lack of informality, because everything had to go through that formal channel because that's the only way that people were communicating. Yes,
exactly.
Okay.
You know, there were lots of meetings, you know, virtual meetings and things like that. But you know, as we're sort of taught in the industry, you need to document everything anyway, sort of afterwards, to make sure that you have this chronicle of a project. But yeah, at that point, you know, the number of emails went up and the content in the emails went up. And then the number of casual conversations drastically dropped.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, this all sort of pulls together very nicely elements from each of the presentations, doesn't it, in terms of how on earth do we move forward from this when we understand that there are big chunks that are missing from a properly functioning sort of organization. And wow, it's yes, we do need to get together at times, don't we, in terms of face-to-face situations, as well as having remote flexibility.
Let me jump in with a question from Majid. So what is the main challenges for transferring the tacit knowledge to be translated into an explicit useful knowledge for the construction management? Before you go, if I can jump in before, because I've also looked at tacit knowledge. So sure. Majid, you don't, the idea is not always to transfer tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge. There's some areas of knowledge that will always remain tacit. And your question about explicit useful knowledge, that part I will let Ellyn do.
You know, I mean, yeah, exactly as Emmanuel indicated. It's not always about, you know, making that knowledge explicit, and it's very hard to make that knowledge explicit. That's, you know, very, very well documented. It's very ephemeral and usually context specific. So it's hard to make that an explicit body of knowledge, you know, and canonize it, if you will, because so much of what we do in the built environment is at once very common and yet very specific to a project or very specific to a firm or a situation. So it's an incredibly complex challenge, and transferring knowledge, even now, I think, as we've been studying sort of this concept of knowledge sharing for 20 plus years, I'm not sure how much we've really advanced. What do you think, Emmanuel? Do you think we've really advanced in our ability to share knowledge in a more...
I don't think so. I would say this. When you see, and one of the main reasons is when you see a team go work with another team, particularly experienced teams, you always talk to them afterward and they're like, I learned so much. Mm-hmm. But they can't really point out what they learned. I learned so much. So there are things that, like you put out, they learned through osmosis. They've been there. They've picked up new things they're going to go use, but they can't still they can't still make it tangible. They have it. No. They've taken this away. They will use it forever, but they don't know what they've got.
Right. And that's part of what surfaced in the interviews as well was, I was conducting this interview and they knew that I had talked to them previously about mentorship and this idea of knowledge sharing. So there was sort of this predisposition, but at the same time, when I started asking them questions that were sort of alluding back to that discussions we'd had previously, it was fascinating because it sort of dawned on them that maybe that hadn't occurred. That they'd been so challenged by just trying to stay in business and just trying to keep everyone together and keep everyone working and the projects flowing that fell by the wayside, which is part of part of my larger research question is, what happens when we have a disruption? Because we have economic disruptions and very, it doesn't always have to be about a pandemic. But we do have a lot of disruptions in the built environment that arise, and knowledge sharing, in my opinion, and what my research has shown, dissipates as a result. I think anytime we're put under stress, that idea of knowledge sharing drops off tremendously.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the discussions, everybody. We've come to the end of our hour now, so we'll have to sign off. But thank you, Jiajing. Thank you, Ellyn. Thank you, Kirsten. And we will break for lunch now and obviously pick up the sessions this afternoon.